Oh, okay. Well, I'm a host. We got a couple of audience members. Okay, there's Doug.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open this public hearing. Topic is amendments to City of St. Helens floodplain regulations. Also a change to size increase of accessory structures allowed without permitting. I'm going to turn it over to our city planner, Jacob Greichen.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yep.
So it is, this is a legislative land use hearing. The subject of this hearing are the amendments to the St. Helens Development Code. As the mayor just talked about, the applicant is the city of St. Helens. Because legislative proceedings require the observance of certain formalities, the council must take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters and required statements. So does any member of the council wish to declare a conflict of interest or bias in this matter? Okay, I don't see any. And we have one audience person. So Trina, do you want to object to the ability of a counselor to make a fair decision?
No, I was in the meeting to talk about my building.
Okay, now Trina, this is a public hearing, and then the regular session, I think it's going to be a different meeting link, and that starts at 7.
Okay.
So
At 7? Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome to watch, but if you want to talk about your building, that 7 o'clock meeting is going to be the one.
All right.
For a visitor
Fabulous.
comments.
Okay.
Okay, so the rules for the conduct of the hearing are set forth on the handout, normally in the back of the room. Generally, the order of proceedings will be as follows: required statement, staff report, applicant's presentation, those in favor of the application, those opposed, rebuttal by the applicant, close of the hearing, close of the record, deliberations, and decision. Following statements are required to be made at the commencement of the hearing, and these are the standards of the decision by the council shall be based on St. Helens Municipal Code 17.20.120, subsection 1, standards for legislative decision. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the applicable standards previously listed or such other criteria in the code or plan which the person believes applies to the decision. So let's talk about the nitty-gritty. There's 2 things we're talking about, and I'll start with the simple one. The simple one is our accessory structure rules. And the accessory structure means a shed, a detached garage, could be a barn, could be a big doghouse. And we have certain rules for those. And one of those provisions, the one we're talking about tonight, is the size that you can get up to without needing a permit. For many years, that number has been 120 square feet. When I started as a planner back in 2001, the building code was 120 square feet. And sometime in the mid-2000s, I don't remember exactly when, but I remember it changing to 200 square feet. Now, we're not changing the building code here, but I bring that up because when a customer comes into City Hall and they say, I want to build a shed, right now the answer that we have to give them is painful. Well, there's the building code and there's these rules, and then there's the development code and there's these rules, and I know you just want to build a shed, but it's really complex. Thank you very much. That's not fun. And so what we want to do is make that answer simpler. And so we are proposing to increase the 120 square feet to 200 square feet. That way it aligns with the building code. We don't see it as a huge impact to the city, and it just makes things a little more flexible. And honestly, it will probably give us more time because we're dealing less with little sheds and we have more time for big things like grocery stores and things like that. It's something that we've talked with the Planning Commission and City Council about even before the public hearings. Everybody seemed on board. Several years ago, I brought this up to the Planning Commission, easily more than 5 years, easily. Might have been 8 or 9. And back then they were resistant to change. But this time they came along. So that's good. So that's a very simple change. do you have any questions on the accessory structure issue?
Yeah, if we went ahead and built an accessory a structure, then what kind of hoops do we have to jump through? I mean, what do we don't go through the permit process, is that correct?
Yeah, so let's say you want to build a shed that's 200 square feet. And it's within the height. The development code says under 15 feet in height from the bottom of the peak.
Right.
So then my answer will be, okay, well, usually we'll ask the person where their property is at. And so we can look at the boundaries and understand where they're putting it to make sure there's not something else that at play, like maybe there's a wetland, or maybe it's close to an intersection where vision clearance will be a problem. But if those things are ruled out, the main thing is make sure no portion of it is closer than 3 feet to a property line.
How many feet?
3
3 feet?
3 feet.
And that would include gutters, any kind of anything on the building at all within
That's correct.
3 feet of the property
Any
line.
projection. So it could be the eave. And I
Yes.
think the idea behind that is to, well, keep neighbors from fighting each other. That doesn't always work. But it helps prevent nuisance drainage and stuff like that. Once you get above the 200 square feet, then the standard setback or yard requirements apply, which are more than 3.
Thank you.
No problem.
One other question. What about electrical and plumbing? Does that need to be inspected, and do you pull a permit for that?
That still applies. So if you want a shed and you want electrical, you'll still need to apply for electrical permit through Columbia County. That's the one type of building permit our department does not handle, and plumbing permits still apply. Yeah,
Good. Thank you for clarifying that.
sure. Any more questions about accessory structures? Okay, don't hear any. So now we're going to talk about the floodplain rules. And, this is a pretty thick report, and a very small portion of it is the accessory structures. The rest of it's the floodplain rules. So first of all, why are we doing this? Well, the last time we had to update these rules was in 2010. And that's when FEMA came out with new floodplain maps. They said, well, you have to adopt this. And by the way, you have to update your code as well. So we did all that. And fast forward to very early November of last year, I thought that was fine. And then we had what's called a community assisted visit. And it's basically someone from FEMA, or in our case, the Oregon Land Division, Department of Land Conservation and Development, visits your community, sees how your floodplain program is doing, audits the program to make sure you're doing it right, and then brings up things like, oh, by the way, the state of Oregon recently approved a model code with FEMA, and you get to update your code again. And so that's why we're here. And we've done everything else. We had to make some application forms and stuff like that. And this is the last part of it. So this is largely based on the Oregon model code, which was approved by FEMA. And that was just approved in August. So I'm guessing we're some of the first communities to adopt ordinance based on this model code. By the way, just for your information, Columbia County is going through a similar exercise now as well. There's quite a bit of changes. I mean, the essence of the code is still the same. If you've read the 21 pages of amendments, you would see there's a variety of new stuff. One of the significant changes of note, and this is something that we talked about, was floodplain management is about mitigating loss. And so one of the things you do for that is to, typically elevate. And I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will make it a little less boring. Okay, you see a diagram instead of my face now?
No.
There you go, Jacob.
Okay,
Kind of.
You'll need to, there you go.
There you go.
Yep.
so this is a diagram, and you've seen this before, but this just shows some ways of elevating a house. You can have a raised foundation, fill, pilings. So that's the essence. And one thing that we talked about before we started the adoption process was, what is the elevation standard? For years, for St. Helens, our residential standard was 1 foot above the determined flood elevation. And on this map here, so this BFE, that's not the informal term that some of us may have used in street talk, but it's base flood elevation. That's what it means. So that's the determined elevation of water in a 100-year flooding event. And so the residential standard says, okay, the lowest floor, which is the lowest habitable portion, not including garages all the time, has to be 1 foot above the BFE. Now, our non-residential standard has been at the base flood elevation or higher. And if you recall, we discussed this, and the council was supportive of increasing that to 1 foot. And by the way, that does align us with the county, who is 1 and 1 as well. And the model code, okay, you get to comply with the model code, but the base flood elevation standard, that is something that we have some latitude on. So these amendments reflect that discussion. There's a lot of other stuff. It's a lot more writing than I get to deal with as a floodplain manager. Oh boy. But I kind of looked at this and what's going to be interesting for you. And one thing that I noticed that is new in here is we have now this definition of functionally dependent use. And this is a concern of mine, because let me back up. If we look at how much floodplain we have in the city, it could be a lot worse. We have floodplain associated with the Columbia River and then with Milton and McNulty Creek. So we don't have that much, but we do have some. But where some of our floodplain is along the river and adjacent to our industrial lands. And I know we have a lot of working waterfront. And as the floodplain administrator, the last thing I want to be is the person saying, well, I know you have this big development project that's going to bring a lot of jobs, but I get to be the guy who says, well, we have to do something different. And that's why when I saw this functionally dependent use definition here, which is means of use which cannot perform its intended purpose unless it's located or carried out in close proximity to water, such as docking facilities, port facilities, and stuff like that. And there is a variance section in this code where, okay, well, the floodplain rules don't work very well as their variance, and this functionally dependent use is specifically called out in that variance. So if I'm ever in that position where there's a major development along the water in the floodplain and we get ourselves in a jam with regulations, we do have that variance for that.
It's good to know because I was opposed to this, if you recall.
I do. So I don't know what else to say. I mean, that's kind of the gist of it.
Jacob, I've got two questions. Reading through this, there's a section starts off mudslides and so on. It talks about ground that could be in a heavy rain flooded. And the ground between 3rd and 4th Street, at least between Columbia and St. Helens and also between St. Helens and Gum Way on heavy rains does get flooded. Once upon a time, it used to be drained through the old sewer system, which it's not. That's one concern I have, because the water just flows over the sidewalks and actually gets in the basements of some of the buildings here. The other place is the lagoon. Where do they measure the lagoon? Is it the bottom of the lagoon, which is now about 1 foot above the standard river level, or the top of the levee?
Well, that's a good question. And if we look, this is one advantage of the Zoom is I have all my stuff right at my fingertips. So there's our floodplain. And according to the floodplain information that we have, you can see that it's right along. So this is the lagoon right here.
That's correct.
In fact, I'll make this a little easier to see because I'm used to looking at all these colors, but you're not. Let me get rid of the addresses. Okay. So it's more or less along that railroad line.
Yeah, but it's what I'm saying is the bottom of the lagoon itself, I mean, it's a plastic line structure. And now there's that levee that's above the railroad. And this shows the floodplain over the top of the railroad. And the railroad, top of the railroad's above the bottom of the lagoon. And this has been a man-made structure. That I'm really wanting a good definition of, is that lagoon basically considered dry land because there's a levee around it? Because it's a levee around what used to be the river.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Levees for floodplains was a big issue back in 2010 when we were updating our maps and stuff back then. And cities that had official levees that protected from floods had to have them certified. And we didn't have any of those, unlike Scappoose, who had to deal with that. So I don't think FEMA considers that a levee. But so let's say that development was proposed on the lagoon. Now these maps, they're only maps. Ultimately, where the floodplain is based on the elevation. And so if development was going to happen around here, I would need to understand the elevation of the property and determine that elevation in relation to the floodplain to determine how to apply those rules.
Because see, let's say we're going to build something right there. I've got to drain the water out to put something on there that I can build on. And all of a sudden, I'm at river level way below the 100-year plain. Now, this is definition now. I do have a levee between me and the river, but I know in some of the Midwest places where they were, quote, protected from the river by the levee, when the levees failed, it was a big problem.
And if the lagoon went away, my assumption is that it would be filled and raising the elevation of the ground to be built on is a pretty classic way to deal with floodplain issues.
Okay. Now, how about the ground between 3rd and 4th Street that gets flooded with heavy rains?
Now, and that's a good question. And so it's a good question to talk about where these rules apply and where they do not. These rules apply to riverine flooding. So floodplains associated with our streams, the river and the creeks. If we go between 4th and 5th in the downtown area, that's outside of the riverine floodplain. And so any localized storm flooding you would have would not be addressed by this particular ordinance. And let me back up. So the National Flood Insurance Program, it's federally mandated if you're a participating community. St. Helens is, as most communities are in the nation. And that means that if we're a participating community, then our citizens are eligible for flood insurance, which is commonly applied to loans for housing. But of course, we have to comply with rules and ordinances, and that's why we're here tonight.
Because one of the problems that's coming up that, again, reading the document, they talk about the ground level is on 4 sides of the building. A number of the buildings in this city, and my building and a number of buildings, the back half is way, way lower than the front half as far as exposed ground level. And if it floods with water, can I get flood insurance? Because the flood is not related to the river, as it is in a number of parts of this town.
Yeah, as my role over the years has been development regulation, not insurance. And so I would guess there's local flood insurance provisions, but that I just, it's not my area.
Okay, but there's no hard rule that you know about that's laid out in here then?
Not for the circumstance that you're talking about.
Okay, that's the question.
Okay, good. Does anybody else have questions? At least the council. Okay, so Matt, we have to go to public testimony. I'm going to stop the share. And so, does anybody want to speak who's not the council about this proposal at all?
If the public does want to speak, you can raise your hand using the participant button. You can also hit yes or no on your participant list to let me know that you would like to speak.
I think Trina's the only non-city person, and I
Yep.
saw her shake her head.
Yep, I agree.
So that means no more comments from the public. There's nothing to rebut. Unless you have any more questions, I think we can be done with the public hearing.
Okay, this public hearing is adjourned. Matt, I need the code for the next meeting.
I will shoot you and the rest of the council a link to the meeting that's going to come up in about 7 minutes.
On the agenda, it's at the bottom of the agenda if you look there.
Yeah, if you do have a copy of the agenda, the Zoom link and the meeting ID is listed. If you do have a
Yeah,
copy of
problem
the
with-
agenda.
I just
Matt, we had a problem with going to at least earlier today at the work session, going to that link because it seemed to be on another document. So Lisa had to come and save me.
Okay, I will email out a link to all of the council members with the link and the meeting ID information.
Thank you.